we're going to go ahead and close this poll. It looks like our main audience here, we have a nice diverse audience, but we do have a lot of child welfare folks, which is great. A lot of our examples are going to be related to our experience working with the court system. So without further ado, we're going to get started here talking a little bit about stress and trauma.
Hi, everyone. This is Lori Sickifuse. Thank you very much for your patience. I apologize for the delay. Yes, we're just going to start off with a basic overview of what we mean by trauma and how that can affect people's thoughts and behaviors overall. So stress. Stress is the basis for trauma. You don't have trauma without stress. But that doesn't mean that stress necessarily leads to trauma. We know, for instance, if I'm preparing for a webinar, right, stress can be positive. It motivates me. It tries to help me be prepared and do good work. And this is like if you're running a race or something like that, that adrenaline can help you, right? That's positive stress. Now, stress isn't always positive, but stress can be tolerable. We've all experienced a lot of negative stress in our lives and a lot of really bad things, but most of the time we've been able to cope and bounce back. Now, it's when stress becomes overwhelming or overloads a system that we see trauma. This is called toxic stress. It's when individuals can't respond to the stress appropriately, and that might be for several different reasons. So when we talk about trauma, what do we actually mean? I know trauma, the word trauma and being traumatized might get thrown around a lot. Trauma can be either experiencing a serious injury to yourself or witnessing a serious injury or death of someone else, facing imminent threats of serious injury or death to yourself or others, could be experiencing a violation of personal physical integrity. And the key thing after any of these events, what happens when you experience trauma is that there are overwhelming feelings of terror, horror, or hopelessness, and you can't deal with those feelings, essentially. You can't manage them. There are several different types of trauma. We have acute trauma, and that's basically what it sounds like. That's a one-time traumatic event. So maybe witnessing a single violent act, being in a car accident, something like that. There's chronic trauma, and that's what we see a lot in survivors of domestic violence. That's being repeatedly exposed to trauma. And that can become a serious problem because when you're having all of these stressful responses over and over again, it's very hard to begin healing from that or managing the stress. There's complex trauma, which is a lot like chronic trauma. Complex trauma is often used to refer to child victims of trauma. And a lot of times the trauma that they might experience can be different types of events. So maybe they're witnessing the abuse of their parents, and they might witness violence in the community as well, different types of traumatic events. There's secondary trauma, and that's something that all of you should be familiar with. This is the trauma that individuals experience when they hear about the suffering of others. And that happens a lot to individuals in helping professions. There's historical trauma, finally, which is trauma that can accumulate across generations. There's a lot of different types of potentially traumatic experiences. I'm not going to go through all of these. These are just examples. They're not exhaustive. And like I was saying before, trauma overwhelms one's capacity to cope. And it leads to a robust fight or flight response physiologically. And Alicia may come and give some examples about this. But basically it triggers a fight or flight response. And we've actually all experienced this fight or flight response in our lives. Whenever we have felt threatened, whether that threat was real to anyone else, it was real to us. I have a fear of flying, and I fly a lot, and every time there's bad turbulence or a plane takes a dip in the sky, I get this. I get anxiety. My heart beats faster. My muscles become tense. There's quick and deep breathing. I am objectively safe, but I don't think I am, right? You all have experienced this type of fight or flight response. All of our experiences have been different. And this is what happens when an individual is exposed to trauma, this fight or flight response. Now, the fight or flight response is actually the most common response to trauma, but there's another option, and that's to freeze. And this basically fulfills the same purpose as fight or flight. It's just a different response, characterized by decreased movement, compliance, avoidance, restrictive affect, and it serves to camouflage, and it gives an individual time to organize themselves and figure out the response. It's a survival mechanism. Now, with these two responses, the fight or flight and freeze, it's important to note that while I might have anxiety and experience this fight or flight response on a plane, you know, as soon as things smooth out, I'm okay and I can go about the rest of my day functioning normally. Victims of trauma can't do that. They never quite get back to the normal state. And although it might not be as severe as the initial response to trauma, this can actually be triggered by a lot of seemingly benign things. Now, this can help us understand some of the reactions with some of the people that we work with. A lot of times there's a lot of hyperarousal, scanning for threats, that's part of the fight or flight, or there's this disassociation, right? That's the freezing response.
So I just want to jump in there in talking about the fight or flight or freeze. Thinking about this in terms of the families that you might work with that have experienced any type of domestic violence. If all of your resources are devoted to a survival mode, to fight, flight, or freeze, how do you have resources to do other things? How do you have resources to pay attention on a day-to-day level, just interacting with another person, or to think through important day-to-day things that we take for granted, like, oh, I need to pay the power bill today, or I need to go visit some of my family or friends, or I need to go to the grocery store. Kind of basic things that we think, oh, of course you have the cognitive capacity to do that. But what we've learned from trauma is that when you're stuck in this perpetual fight or flight, all your resources are just devoted to survival. So you have a lot of trouble concentrating, you have trouble with your memory, you have trouble learning new things. It's just a very physiological response that interferes with normal day-to-day tasks. And we've probably all seen the freeze option, especially if you hear language like someone's being unresponsive, I'm trying to talk to them and they're ignoring me, or they just shut down. Some of those are freeze options, and they're based on a mechanism that's been put in place to figure out how to cope with something. What do I need to do to survive? And this is one of the skills or one of the methods that we've developed over time from an evolutionary perspective to do that.
Thank you. So there are several implications for human development with this exposure to trauma, right? As Dr. Summers just mentioned, there are these biological implications where your brain becomes wired for fight, flight, or freeze. There's psychological implications. There's disrupted attachments, poor emotional regulation. Social consequences can include hostile attribution bias, disengagement, and sense of foreshortened future. And this all affects the individual. Now you can see with all of these implications for human development, it makes it very, very difficult to function on a day-to-day basis. So we have another polling question for you. I'd like to know how many of you have heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or the ACEs study. So we have a pretty good distribution of results here. It looks like a little over 1/3 of you have never heard of it. In the middle, there are several of you that know some about it. And then it looks like almost 1/4 of you know about the ACEs study, and you also apply it in your work. Okay, great. We're going to move on. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the ACEs study for those of you who might not know as much about it or might not use it in your work. And so this is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and the results of this study really kind of motivated the conceptualization of trauma as a public health issue. And this study was conducted in the 1990s. It involved, I think it was about 17,000 participants. They were outpatients at a California clinic. There was nothing particularly remarkable about them, just basic outpatients. And they were actually asked to complete a survey about experiences during childhood that could have been traumatic or adverse childhood experiences. And you see the ACEs test on your screen right here. And so what happened with these individuals is they reported on their adverse childhood experiences. There are 10 questions here. And then the researchers actually compared their ACEs scores to their health-related behaviors and health-related outcomes that they experienced later on in life. And so I'm not going to go through all of these. I know that this is probably pretty small print, but basically questions such as observing abuse, observing domestic violence, was an adult incarcerated, were you neglected, were your needs met, were your parents ever separated or divorced, things like that. And for each one of these events that you experience, you get a 1. So what did we find in the ACEs study? We find that about four adverse childhood experiences are about the tipping point for negative health consequences and outcomes in life. Now, I want to preface this first by saying that we've had very successful individuals take this test, and they've shared their results with us. And there are some of them that will have all 10. They've been very successful in life. Having a higher ACEs score does not necessarily mean that an individual is going to experience these negative outcomes. However, there is a very strong relationship that we can't ignore. So those with ACEs score that's 4 or higher, they're twice as likely than their counterparts to smoke, 7 times more likely to be alcoholics, 6 times more likely to have had sex before the age of 15. They're twice as likely to have been diagnosed with cancer. And I should say that these are just some of the outcomes. This is not an exhaustive list. 10 times more likely to have injected street drugs, and they're 12 times as likely to have attempted suicide. So again, just because an individual has a high ACEs score doesn't mean that they're going to experience these outcomes, but these relationships are really too strong to ignore. This was the first study that found this, that there have been multiple replications of this in different areas using different populations, and they're finding the same thing. I think Dr. Summers is going to talk a little bit about domestic violence in ACEs.
So some of the research that we've done, if you're familiar with it or if you heard what Lori just said, we looked at several forms of adverse experiences that occurred. They looked at several forms of adverse experiences that occurred prior to age 18 in a household, and these included physical abuse, sexual abuse, and exposure to domestic violence. Some of the research has been done, and there's a ton of research, and if you're interested, you can go to acesstudy.org and get a list of all the different research that's been done related to this. But what we found is when they looked in particular at some of the physical violence in the home and exposure to domestic violence in the home, they saw a relationship. And again, this is not causal, but a strong correlation between individuals who experience these adverse experiences in childhood and activity later in adulthood, to the extent that they found that having these different ACEs actually predicted the likelihood of becoming a victim and a perpetrator of domestic violence. So for children with the different forms of violent ACEs, found that women are 3.5 times more likely to become victims of domestic violence, and men are 3.8 times more likely to perpetuate domestic violence when it occurred in the home. So we have found some of this that's been directly related to the work that we're doing. And we know that these traumatic experiences in childhood can affect the entire life course, starting with risky behaviors in adolescence all the way through early death. It's one of the most interesting findings that they've seen related to the ACEs, but we know it has a very strong relationship to domestic violence. What we learned from that, or one way that we like to put that is, we learned that hurt people hurt people. We see this a lot in our juvenile delinquency population. We have found that these numbers, just to give you some perspective on this, the number of people that have 4+ ACEs is pretty low in the general population. About 13 to 16% have experienced 4 or more. A third of people have 0, none of these ACEs. So the numbers of people who've had in the general population 4 or more is fairly low. When we start looking at our juvenile delinquency population, the children that are detained, what we see is 99% of them have had at least 1, and numbers close to 30 to 50% have had 4 or more. And so we're seeing that the people who've experienced trauma and been hurt as a child are more likely to engage in behaviors that hurt others as an adult. And we think that this is true for batterers as well. You're getting individuals who are exposed to domestic violence in the home, and the males are more likely to perpetuate violence as they get older. It's essentially a trauma reactive interaction. You have the person who is exposed to this in the environment, and there might be some individual factors related to the person that makes them more likely to do this, but the environment plays a key role. What you're exposed to as a child plays a key role, not only in your brain development, but also in the development of the behaviors that you consider as normal and that you're going to engage in as an adult. So what we've learned essentially is trauma is a risk factor for future trauma, both for victim and perpetration.
And I'm not going to talk extensively about post-traumatic stress disorder, but I want to touch on it a little bit because this is a primary result of exposure to traumatic stress. And I want to emphasize that the development of PTSD is associated with an individual's loss of ability to act on his or her environment and an existentially threatening experience being forced upon a person. And this is going to make a little more sense later as we talk about how to heal from trauma. And I want to stress again that, like Dr. Summers was discussing before, is that this survival mode really changes how individuals interpret and respond to their environment. Day-to-day tasks that you and I think are really easily cannot be navigated very well when you're in this constant state of fight or flight. You know, if you are in the woods and there's a tiger, you're not going to sit down and consider about all of the, you know, be reasonable in all the ways to escape from the tiger, right? You're just going to have that response. When I'm on a plane and I'm having an anxiety attack, I can't pull out my laptop and do work. So again, the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, we have avoidance. So that's avoiding traumatic reminders, and that could be characterized if you see clients that are withdrawn, clients that are fearful, that kind of a thing. Constant re-experiencing, nightmares and intrusive memories. And the hyperarousal is probably the most noticeable characteristic in a lot of the children and families that suffer from this. That's abnormally increased arousal. A lot of responsiveness to stimuli and scanning for threats. And interestingly, if you think about this hyperarousal and these symptoms, if you're looking at children particularly, although this is true in adults as well, this sounds a lot like ADHD. And ADHD is a very real thing, and children and adults alike suffer from it. But we also know that a lot of times these symptoms of trauma, these hyperarousal symptoms, are actually mistaken for ADHD. So with co-occurring with post-traumatic stress disorder, we see depression and we see substance abuse, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that and its incidence in families that are affected by domestic violence specifically in just a few minutes. But really, the message is this. So this is the behavior that you're seeing, and these individuals have been traumatized. But we have to think about the rest of the story. Trauma isn't necessarily an excuse for certain behaviors, but it's the reason. And knowing that rest of the story helps inform responses to these children and these families.
What we know for statistics is as many as 54 to 84% of survivors suffer from PTSD. Those numbers are huge when you think about the population of persons that might develop PTSD. General population, the numbers are much, much lower. But survivors are much more likely. These rates, if I'm not mistaken, are higher than the rates of veterans coming back from war. So we know that this is a possibility, that trauma can lead to this diagnosis, to some of these symptoms and some of these problems with families. Some studies report rates of 33 to 88%. So we have on the high end, and of course, you have to think about all these in the context of the methodology and who the sample is of the studies. But we know that there's a big range here and that we have a good chunk of people who've experienced domestic violence in the home who are suffering from post-traumatic stress. And this can affect, as a parent, how you interact with your child. The research indicates that there's some potential effects of PTSD. There might be some problems with bonding and attachment. And if you think about that just logically, you can see some of the conceptual reasons this might be the case. If parents are avoidant or disengaged in some way, it's going to be harder for them to bond with anyone, but to devote that attention necessary to bond with their child. There's also going to be hyperarousal and hypervigilance, which will affect interactions. Lack of consistency and stability, which can affect parenting in a negative way, and the children may feel unsafe if this is going on in the home and the parents have developed post-traumatic stress, because their responses might make them, the parents' responses might make them feel unsafe in some way. We've also found that there might be some indirect effects of post-traumatic stress on children. The children might start experiencing developmental problems, so they're having trouble with school. They aren't learning or meeting the milestones in the way that they should be meeting them. They might have behavioral problems and start acting out either at school or at home. They might have insecurities or decreased self-esteem. And the children might have secondary traumatic stress as a result of it. So it's not their own trauma, but experiencing someone else's trauma, that person might create these symptoms in a child. So it can negatively affect parenting in those ways. We also know that, as we talked about earlier, PTSD is associated with depression and substance use. So trauma can lead to people kind of having mental health issues, things like depression. We know 50 to 74% of survivors experience depression, 38 to 57% experience anxiety. And of course, these numbers are varied because you're looking at multiple studies, multiple samples, and it's not always a clear picture of whether someone experiences depression or anxiety or whether they're even diagnosed with that if that occurs. So these might even be underrepresentations of how often this is occurring in the field. We've also found that batterers have increased incidence of depression. So think about that in terms of how that might affect how you would interact with the family. The batterer might have PTSD. The batterer might have experienced trauma as a child growing up. The batterer might be currently experiencing mental health issues, all of which might affect their behavior and their parenting style, as well as their behavior affecting the survivor parent in terms of how they're going to respond. So there could be a lot of complex dynamics going on in the home as a result of earlier traumas. We also know that there's been some studies related to depression, particularly in mothers. So we found out that maternal depression is related to developmental delays. Again, those problems meeting milestones for children. It's related to attachment problems, developing appropriate attachments for children, which can lead into relationship problems even in later life. Also related to problems at school. Depressed mothers are more likely to express negative affect and criticize their adolescent children. So this can be damaging to self-esteem and the relationship development at a critical time. Adolescence is such a critical time for development for youth when they're trying to develop their own identity and determine what they want to do. So parenting, especially at some critical points in time, if they're suffering from depression as a result of their trauma, it may affect parenting in these ways. Also found some effects of the relationship between domestic violence and substance abuse. So the incidence of substance abuse among survivors and perpetrators is significantly higher than in similar populations. And what we mean by similar populations is we would look at demographics like age, race and ethnicity, background, socioeconomic status. So if you look at someone who is similar to you in other ways, you would see that survivors and perpetrators are much more likely to abuse substances, and that's both alcohol and other drugs. So we see these co-occurring fairly frequently. And sometimes that is interpreted in specific ways when you look at the families in these cases. It's like, well, there's alcohol-related domestic violence incidents, and it might be just alcohol-related, but it might be something beyond that. But the trauma from experienced in childhood or earlier in life can create some of these problems by populations start self-medicating. So if you've experienced trauma and you haven't coped with that or dealt with the trauma of something in your childhood or something in your past, a lot of people start self-medicating, and they'll start self-medicating with alcohol or other substances, and that turns into a problem as it affects their other coping skills and their ability to function on a day-to-day basis as a parent, in employment, as a productive member of society, as a family member. And we see more of that than we should with survivors and perpetrators of domestic violence. And of course, any time that there's an effect on a parent, there's likely to be an effect on the children. So the effects on the children could be varied, particularly if there's alcohol or substances used during pregnancy. But for parents who abuse substances, they found that alcohol use in parents is related to poor cognitive skills and learning disabilities in youth. That if it's a substance abuse in general, they're more likely to be neglectful, almost 3 times more likely to report abusive behavior, and then there's an increased risk of both sexual and physical violence. Now, I don't have a poll question for this, but think about the families that you interact with for those of you in child welfare or even in other systems who might have experienced domestic violence. What do you think the percentages of those who come into contact with some sort of child welfare who also have a substance abuse issue? I can tell you while you're thinking about that part of the work that we do here looks at child abuse and neglect cases all over the country. At this point, I've reviewed thousands of case files all over the country with differing allegations of abuse and neglect for the families. Oftentimes, the numbers that you see are somewhat staggering. We've been in jurisdictions before where 80% or more of the neglect charges had allegations of substance abuse, alcohol, or drugs. So the numbers are kind of varied, but we do see a big chunk of the cases that come under child welfare that have these substance abuse allegations, and it's part of what they consider neglect. So there's a neglect allegation, and it's related to the substance use. And we know that trauma is one of the reasons that people begin abusing substances. So the two are related, and clearly, if their family is being neglectful, they're more and being physically abusive, they're more likely to start interacting with some other systems, and the children are not safe, which does negatively affect their parenting. We've also looked at there's been some research that's looked at domestic violence and parenting styles. If you remember way back to intro psych or human development, there's 3 parenting styles. There's authoritarian, authoritative, and a permissive or indulgent parenting style. If you had to guess off the top of your head, I'm guessing you could probably think what batterers might fall into. The authoritative are demanding and responsive parents, authoritarian, demanding and unresponsive, and the indulgent are considered responsive but not demanding. A lot of times with batterers, you see that authoritarian, demanding, and unresponsive parenting style. And the research shows that's not as effective as other styles. And there's several different, if you look at the literature on that broadly, not just in the context of domestic violence, you'll note that those seem to have, the ones with the authoritative seem to have the best outcomes for children and families, and the others have higher incidences of self-esteem, behavior problems, or youth engaging in kind of high-risk behaviors. So we have our batterers that are more controlling and manipulative and inconsistent in how they parent, which creates some problems for children who need consistency and strong boundaries in the family, but also need someone to be responsive to them, to explain why there's a rule in place, to be there to meet their individual needs. It's also found that survivors can be aggressive when they feel that their children are not safe, and that domestic violence in general for both parents has been linked to inconsistencies in parenting styles, which makes sense. It's nice that we have research to support that, but if you think about the environment and the everyday trauma that the families deal with, it's pretty easy to see why there might be inconsistencies in parenting. One of our other key messages that we wanted to get across as part of this work is when you think about parenting styles and domestic violence and parenting in general, it's important to think about the responses to trauma are meant to be adaptive and promote survival, but they don't always make sense across contexts. So if you think back to the fight or flight or freeze, those are physiological responses that you would do to survive. If that's your day-to-day life, then you're going to engage in these behaviors. Well, how effective are those behaviors when you're trying to interact with someone in one of the systems, agencies that we work with? So if I'm trying to work with someone from child welfare and I am experiencing trauma and I kind of shut down and stop talking to you, that's going to come across as uncooperative, unresponsive. It really just might be a freeze response. I feel threatened because there's a threat of my children being removed, or there's a threat that talking to someone from these agencies is going to escalate violence in my home, so I might freeze, and then it comes across as uncooperative. It might also be that parents become hostile or aggressive, and that might be their fight response kicking in because of a perceived threat. And if you've experienced a lot of threats and they're experiencing post-traumatic stress, things that are not threats still might be perceived as threatening to an individual. Psychologically, our view of the world changes. So things coming in from someone who's trying to talk to you and help you work with your family, help you work with the agency in a certain way might be misperceived. And the individual might act out in a hostile way or in a froze-up way, but really those skills were useful to them. They might have been effective. They've kept them alive. They might have kept the children safe in the home, because that fight response that the survivor parent might have might be because when they felt threatened or they felt that their child was threatened in some way, they might have picked a fight with the batterer to keep the attention on them. And so it might be an adaptive and natural. So the big message about trauma and how it affects behavior, one of the big messages is it's important to think about behavior in context. That's what we'd like to do right now. I know we're a little short on time because we got started a little late. So what I want to do is kind of read you, and I know that if I'm reading to you, it's going to be harder for you to pay attention since you don't have visual words on the screen, at least if you're like me. But please bear with me. I'm going to read you a little case scenario and have you think about how you might work with this family. So Tanya's 25 years old. Her and her husband, Sean, have 2 children, Jordan, who's 11 months, and Carly, who's 4 years. Tanya's father left her mother when she was an infant. Both Tanya's mother and her new stepfather abused alcohol and had trouble keeping full-time jobs. Growing up, Tanya witnessed her stepfather slapping and punching her mother on several occasions. Once, Tanya's stepfather pushed her mother into a wall and threatened her mother with a knife. He told Tanya if she ran for help that he would kill both her and her mother. When Tanya was 12, her stepfather began crawling into bed with her at night and sexually abusing her. He threatened to kill her and her mother if she told anyone. Tanya dropped out of school when she was 16 and began working full-time to help pay rent for her family's apartment. When she was 20, she got her GED and started dating Sean, who she met at work. Soon after, Tanya moved in with Sean. Their first child was born shortly after they were married. Sean insisted that Tanya stay home with their child while he worked full-time. When Tanya was 12, her stepfather began, I lost my place, excuse me. Soon after she moved in with Sean, their first child was born, and Sean insisted that Tanya stay home with the child while he worked full-time. After their first child, Carly, was born, Sean became more controlling of Tanya. He gave her a weekly allowance to buy food and other essentials for the family and would sometimes push or slap her when she asked for more money. Sean began to isolate Tanya from her family and friends, telling her that these other relationships interfered with her being a good mother and a good wife. He often told her that she is worthless and stupid and nobody else would ever want her. Tanya sometimes lied to Sean and snuck out during the day to visit her family. Sean found out he cut off all her access to the family bank account and told her that he would hurt her if she tried to earn or borrow money. Sean's occasional physical abuse of Tanya escalated into regular physical abuse. Sometimes Sean hit Tanya because he thought she was cheating. Other times, he was crying and her waking them up in the middle of the night when he had to work early the next day. When Carly was 2 years old, she crawled out of bed during a physical altercation between Tanya and Sean. Sean punched Carly in the face, giving her a black eye and a bloody nose. Tanya's family and friends are frustrated that Tanya is not in regular contact with them. They know that Sean can be demanding, but blame Tanya for not standing up to him. So think about this case scenario for a minute. Think about if you have this family to work with, how would you approach the case? Think about recommendations you would make, and then what you look for in reviewing responses to the case. What were the things that stood out to you in this, based on what you already know, but some of the things that we've talked about today? So yeah, the cycle of abuse is repeated. She was abused as a child and she married an abuser. We've seen statistics around that. Layers of trauma are at the core of the issue. So it's not just one traumatic event. There's a lot of different components going on that are affecting the family. Okay, so in thinking about a response, there's a lot of ways to do it, but getting the children out of the home is going to be one way to respond. Thinking about, just in general, the big pieces in it, seeing that there's lots of ACEs events and there's another intergenerational cycle of trauma.
Right. What's the history? I see empowering the mother. That's really important, and we'll talk about that if we have time in a little bit. So what we're seeing here is that a lot of you are considering trauma as a factor in this, right? Now, let's think about this. What if this was all you knew? 12 months later, the CPS investigation found that the children were living in a dirty home. The 11-month-old has low body weight, does not respond normally to adult interactions, and may be diagnosed with failure to thrive. The 4-year-old girl, Carly, appears despondent and withdrawn, and she has several bruises on her face and back. Both the mother and father appear to be under the influence of alcohol. So what if that's all you knew? Would that change the way you'd respond to the case or the recommendations that you would make? Right. And we're not saying here there's clearly safety issues that need to be addressed. So we're, failure to thrive, if there's something like that going on, that's a big deal. The child has bruises on her. But the big lesson from this really is what you see depends on how you look at it. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that drawing there on the left. It could be either an old lady or a young woman, and you always see one of them first, but after you see both, you can't unsee them. We're not saying that this family doesn't have needs that need to be addressed. We're not saying that we don't need to take the children's safety seriously. But the more we know about this case and the potential effects that trauma is having on the parenting, the more we can do to increase the likelihood that this family is going to benefit from help, right? The last polling question, and this has to do with the incidence of domestic violence and child protection cases. So I'm wondering what you think. How many child protection cases do you think involve either allegations or reports of domestic violence? And this is just allegations or reports. So we're detecting the domestic violence in these cases. So looks like most of you are saying it's between 51 and 75%. And now I think a lot of you know this is a very hard thing to research, right? Because there's a lot of underreporting and lack of detection when it comes to domestic violence. Okay. And this poll, and the research indicates that the majority of you were correct. So it's about between 30 to 60% of all child protection cases involve domestic violence. Now, these are the cases in which domestic violence is being reported or being detected. This is likely a pretty vast underestimate, considering that a lot of women fail to report domestic violence for a lot of reasons, shame, fear, primarily because they are afraid that CPS is going to take away their child because of this, and they might not get their child back. And I would like to talk about this a little bit more, but I want to get to what I think is one of the most important pieces. So I can, you can always email us with questions, and we'll have this webinar posted, but we want to talk a little bit now about what to consider in these types of cases. Basically, what are we going to do about this?
What we've done as our work here at the National Council is to focus on trauma broadly. And so instead of looking at specific interventions or evidence-based practices that might work with a population or with batterers or with victims, we've looked at the system. At the system level, how can we do something different related to trauma? And the things that we've come up with for any of the systems and agencies that we work with is that we can take a universal precautions approach to trauma. And what that means is make an assumption that all the families in the child protection or child custody system or in the systems that you work in, including those affected by domestic violence, but just make an assumption that all of them have probably been exposed to trauma in some way at some point in their life, and focus on it that way. So instead of just assuming that they don't until you see a sign, if you make an assumption that probably everyone who's coming in has been injured in some way or maybe experienced some sort of trauma, then think about that in terms of how that might affect how they get treated within the system and how the system itself can be modified to promote healing. And that's what we really want to be able to do within our systems. Even within the court system, court systems have very specific roles, but the reality is there's an opportunity with any of the family-serving agencies in our society to promote healing in a meaningful way without being direct service providers. And to us, the promotion of healing is really about creating core conditions within your system. And those core conditions we consider are safety, agency, and connectedness. Now, if you want to download the PowerPoint, it's under your materials tab right there. We have slides that are going to give you some examples of all of these, but because we're running out of time, what we're going to do is just give you a couple examples right now and then take about 2 minutes for questions, or 5 minutes if some of you would like to stay on a little over the time you have allotted to do this. But what we consider safety is, in order for someone to heal, they have to be safe. What can we do within our system to make families feel safe, to make survivors feel safe, or even to make the perpetrator, the batterers, to make them feel safe. So what we know is domestic violence survivors need to feel safe to begin the healing process. We have to create conditions where there's not blame on the survivor, so we don't use victim-blaming language. They have to feel safe to be able to express themselves in working with the families. We have to help develop a safety plan. Ideally, if you can get them safe, the idea is that they can create safety for their children. So making them feel safe. Part of this is not punishing survivors for failure to protect if they took reasonable actions to try to protect their children. And the reasonableness has to be considered in the context of what we know about trauma and how that might affect behavior. We also want to give them a sense of agency, and agency is really choice. If you think about the conditions that create post-traumatic stress disorder, there's things that happen to a person that's completely outside of their control. They have feelings of helplessness or hopelessness or terror when they're exposed to trauma. If we can give some of that control back to the individual, we have an opportunity to help them promote healing. So there should be opportunities for services that are tailored, and there should be choices given when available. And I always like to talk to, when I talk to judges in particular, but I like to talk to the stakeholders that I work with, and they say, well, they have to engage in these services, or they have to do this. And my thought is always, well, if they can have choice, like, can you go to this substance abuse treatment, or would you prefer this one? If you're coming to court, do you prefer Tuesday or Thursday, or mornings or afternoons? It doesn't have to be a big choice, but any choice can help promote these conditions of healing. And part of that choice is having a voice and having that voice heard as part of the system. And then the final bullet we have on here is connectedness. All of the resiliency literature has demonstrated that having a person is a critical factor in promoting resilience with youth and with adults. Having a person that they can rely on. For our children, we'd love it to be, if there's children who are exposed to domestic violence in the home, we'd love that person to be a parent if they can be placed safely with a parent and have that person who's there for them. But even if they can't, if we can help find supports for survivors or batterers involved in the system, then we can help create these conditions of healing. And these are just examples of what we've just said. We like to end on a question like, what can you do? Take in what you've learned. Is there something that you can do differently immediately, or something that you can apply by next week? Something that can be done immediately. Most of our stuff, we don't need a lot of resources to make small changes in practice that can affect families who are affected by trauma. Questions? I know we're out of time. But we could probably take a minute or two if anyone's willing to stay on the line and answer any questions. And then our email addresses are up here as well. We'd be more than happy to answer any follow-up questions that you have via email. And I see that comment in the comment box, treating people like human beings will go a long way. We completely agree. All of our trauma work here at the Council is very focused on respectful treatment, having a voice in the system, allowing that opportunity to be heard and be treated like they're part of the decision-making process and be involved in that way and engaged in that way, we think is critical in the work that we do with families. So I have it at 11:01. I'm going to give one more minute for questions, but just in case anyone has those. But I did want to say thank you for your attendance at this webinar. We apologize again for the slight technical difficulties we had at the beginning, but we hope that you found this information useful and it can be something that you can bring back to the work that you do. We are always available for follow-up questions, so please feel free to jot down our information and let us know if there's other things that you're interested in knowing about. And if we don't know, it really helps to inform and drive our future work to get the answers that you need to be able to better work with children and families.
Hi, Connie. I do see your question about a link to the webinar. It will be on the Resource Center website, and once it's posted, we will be sending out a notification to all registrants where they can view the webinar. Thank you. The link to view the webinar will be on the Resource Center website. It's rcdvcpc.org, and I will be sending out the link to registrants once it has been posted. A certificate of attendance will be provided once you complete the survey. You'll be able to request one at the bottom of the survey.
So in the web links, there's the survey link. If you have a minute to fill that out, give us any feedback, that'd be wonderful. We would really appreciate it. There should be a pod on your screen on the right-hand side, kind of in the middle, that says web links, and a survey with an exclamation point. If I'm not mistaken, that is the survey that they're talking about here. So if you fill that out, plus we love feedback. Let us know what we can do better. We want to keep improving so that others can learn more about the system. We want to know what you like us to do differently so that we can improve. We always appreciate feedback.
All right, thank you guys so much for joining. We're going to close out now. Once we close out, you will be automatically directed to the survey. So thank you very much in advance for filling that out. Have a great day.